I'm a little concerned, Mr. Chair, about the nature of what's occurring here. It seems like the state is trying to nationalize a company, and I'm a little concerned about how that occurs in other areas. So I guess one of the questions I would have is, what other examples do we have that we could research where a privately owned, publicly owned and traded corporation was bought out by a state or other government that where it worked, and I could look at it. I've looked at the history of PG&E, and they've got a remarkable history on Wikipedia. But I'm concerned about how would it work. Two, where would the funding come from? The report states that it could cost up to $5.88 billion. And so would that come from the rainy day fund, or would we ask CalPERS or CalSTRS to step in? Or are we going to use funds from our retiree medical trust, or are we going to use debt proceeds? And then how would we as a legislature know how it pencils out, because we certainly want to avoid rate increases. So the third question I would ask is, we're sort of saying that we're going to bid for it if it were in the bankruptcy, but I just want to know how that works, because there's a point on page 9 of the staff report that is rather coercive and, you know, almost like an eminent domain kind of opportunity where the free market doesn't really have a chance to participate. And so I guess in closing, my concerns would be, you know, how well would the state of California run PG&E should it take over control? You know, I don't want to get too cynical, but I've certainly been a little frustrated with the Employment Development Department of late, the DMV, Fiscal. We don't even have our CAFR out yet, our Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. We're the only state that hasn't done that, and we have one of the largest unrestricted net deficits. And I'm just, you know, just really concerned about whether we're capable of actually running an operation of this substance. So I guess in the closing, how do the positives outweigh the minuses, other than, you know, just being a little strong-handed? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vice Chair. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Hill. Are there any comments that you'd like to be able to make to the Vice Chair's comments that he just made?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question from my good friend from Riverside, who I admire and respect so much. I'm just a little surprised by some of the questions and comments, because all of that information was laid out in that analysis and staff report, which clearly identifies, clearly articulates the fact that this is not a public, this is not a government-owned, would not be a government-financed utility. If it were to, in fact, come to fruition, or if the circumstances required for Golden State Energy to assume the responsibility and ownership of the company, and for a number of reasons. One, this will be formed initially with a board of 9 members, 5 appointed by the governor, 2 from the Senate, 2 from the Assembly. And then after that, it would transition, and that board, original board, would, using a search firm, try to find and develop a board stature and structure that would fit certain skill set matrices that are necessary to operate a utility. At all time, this would be owned by, at the time of the purchase, owned by the ratepayers, not by government at all. Government would not be financing it. As the analysis says, and as we've discussed previously, the funding and financing would be secured through the iBank, which could give us the money that would be necessary, and ratepayers would then be providing the resources back to the iBank and to the state to meet that obligation, and certainly be passing that on to the ratepayers. The interesting part is that if we had, you know, we have many public utilities. SMUD, in fact, in Sacramento is a government utility that does provide a good service. This is a hybrid, pretty much, from a public government ownership to a ratepayer-owned utility. The benefit of that is that as a ratepayer-owned utility, we would be, and according to this, subject to the regulations of the Public Utilities Commission. As you know, public municipal utilities today are not subject to any regulatory authority of the Public Utilities Commission. Now, there was a time when I would have probably said that's not a bad thing, but today, with the reformed and structure and leadership of the Public Utilities Commission, they have the ability, and I believe will do, an extraordinary job of managing, overseeing this new utility. And it's not necessarily determined that if the circumstances occur that Golden State Energy would take over, or in fact, if PG&E fails in the future, that would be left to the marketplace to decide. The Public Utilities Commission would certainly remove or take away their license of convenience and necessity, or certificate of license of necessity, and then it would be up to the PUC to find whatever buyer would be in place to do that. Golden State Energy, and the reason we're doing this today, is to position itself, and so that there is no lapse of service to the customers, that there is an entity in place, if in fact it is the best offer, the best position to secure that they are ready to do that. We don't want to take a chance. We don't want to gamble with the fact, or with the ratepayers, or the service territory, or the 16 million customers that PG&E has today. We want to make sure that there is someone in place. This is that plan, and in that, I think I've answered, or at least addressed some of your questions, Senator. So thank
Mr.
you.
Vice Chair?
I want to thank the senator for his thoroughness in his response. I appreciate it. Just curious, you know, running a business and having the ratepayers be the stakeholders, what we're just going to rely on insurance and other vehicles to make sure that when something else happens in the future, that they would be protected. And so I guess my question would be, what safeguards do we have in place?
Sure. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Please.
There are a couple of issues. Certainly, as this is defined as a public benefit nonprofit corporation, because of that status, it will be paying no state income tax. Secondly, it will not be paying any rate of return on those investments. So there's no shareholder payments or dividends to shareholders, which today for PG&E amounts to $1.5 billion to $2 billion when they were a good company and when they become one again. So there's a couple of $1 billion there, as well as the savings in of corporate income tax to the state that would be not spent and saved. So if you look at that over a period of time, that money does leave the ratepayers responsible for that liability with insurance, with the wildfire fund that we established last year that will protect the utility from a tremendous amount of that liability. But just as in this legislation, a penalty that will, if the utility fails in some regard, as Golden State Energy, and a penalty is assessed against them, whereas in a investor-owned utility, that penalty would go to shareholders by law. Here, it would go to the ratepayers. But my assumption, my feeling, and why I support this is that the savings over time, because of the rate of return and the amount of investment that's necessary going forward in infrastructure costs to harden our grid and to make it work, is substantial, and that savings will be substantial for Golden State Energy. So I believe the cost would actually be a savings to the ratepayers in the future rather than a greater cost.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Vice Chair?
Thank you, Senator.